Well, good afternoon, everyone, and a very pleasant hat from Detroit Public TV. It's my pleasure to be your host for this celebration of the many Asian American communities that call Metro Detroit our home. We have a terrific event for you lined up around the Asian Americans coming up on PBS. But first, I'd like to start out with a few words from Rich Homburg, our CEO and General Manager, and then from Rebecca Islam, the Executive Director of APIA Vote Michigan, our partners in this project. Rich Homburg, over to you.
Good afternoon, folks, and thank you for being here. It is heartwarming to see how many folks have elected to join us today. I wanted to welcome all of you to our virtual celebration of the many Asian American communities that call Metro Detroit home. As many of you know, we originally planned for this to be a mass public event, then COVID-19 comes along, and so we've all become Zoom experts, and welcome to the new home of Detroit Public Television, the Zoom channel and internet portals across the landscape. While we're a little disappointed in not being able to hold the event, hundreds of you have signed up to join us today. It is very, very encouraging. It shows the interest and the pride that the many Asian American communities have in Detroit and who deeply care about their legacy and traditions. We couldn't have produced this event today without the help of many organizations, artists, historians, and others who have taught us a lot about their culture and their heritage. Today's an interactive program, and the result of that, of the program is their guidance, or results out of their guidance. At Detroit Public Television, we believe it is our responsibility. In fact, it is a key core value of the organization to understand communities and to help tell their stories. We can only do that justice through the strong engagement with partners like the folks you're going to talk to today. If you trust us with your story, we will do everything in our power to get it right. We have a great partner today in the APIA Vote Michigan group, a group that is doing wonderful things in our community and not only encouraging voters, but to make sure everyone is counted during the census. It's now my pleasure to introduce the Executive Director of APIA Vote Michigan, Rebecca Islam, who is going to help us, who has helped us through every step of the way in building today's program. Thanks. Enjoy.
Thank you, Rick. Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca Islam, Executive Director with Asian Pacific Islander American Vote, commonly known as APIA Vote Michigan. And first off, happy Asian American Heritage Month to everyone watching. And I hope that everyone is safe and healthy during these uncertain times. And thank you, Detroit Public Television, for their partnership and their support and bringing us all together and showcasing the Asian American heritage and how it has evolved over the years. And I believe now more than ever, this is the time to reflect on the rich history and uplift the diverse cultures of the API communities. API Michigan is a nonprofit grassroots organization committed to justice and equity for the entire Asian American community through grassroots mobilization. And here at APIAVote Michigan, we uphold a vision of justice and equity that asserts people power and community connectedness as the framework for democracy, as the framework for decision-making and community engagement and services. Like it was mentioned, that our impact in the API community, it involves around increasing voter registration, census workshops, advocating for public policy, assisting folks with citizenship application, as well as youth development. And what motivates us every day are the heartfelt stories from our Asian American community members that reveal the challenges from our communities for realizing the American dream. So I feel that it is our duty to keep fighting for their access to the American promises of equity and opportunity for all. So I encourage everyone watching today to please visit our website to learn more about us and how you can get involved in the fight that we're in. You can find all the information on APIAVoteMichigan.org. And thank you so much again for joining us. And we hope that you'll enjoy the rest of the event. Thank you so much.
Rebecca Islam and Rich Homburg, great thanks to the both of you. The program today is an ambitious one. In fact, we decided to extend it till 2 p.m. Eastern time. Originally, we were going to go to 1:30. If you have to leave early, that's okay. We're going to post the whole thing on our website, DetroitPublicTV.org, for later viewing. We're hosting this event in conjunction with next week's premiere of the 2-day, 5-hour PBS series, The Asian Americans, It's been 7 years in the works. We're excited to premiere it next week. We're going to show you a preview of the series, including a segment on a tragic event that took place in Detroit. Then we'll come back and introduce our very distinguished panel. There'll be a great report from our own One Detroit team and the challenges the community has faced, but also galvanize the local Asian American community here in Detroit. So we'll look forward to presenting that to you. And there will be time for questions as well. But to help set the mood for the conversation, we will hear from award-winning author, speaker, poet, journalist, educator, and much more, Frances Tiwa Chang. Frances, to you.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm Frances Tiwa Chang, and this is a poem I was asked to write for this event, Finding Home, Crafting Community. 1. First, I heard from the high schoolers at Chinese school that all their parents were stocking up on rice and bottled water. Then I heard about the fights breaking out in the California Costcos. Don't mess with Asian aunties. Weeks later, the rest of America went crazy for toilet paper. But I am the child of immigrants. So while y'all were #quarantine baking sourdough bread, I was sprouting bean sprouts, grinding soy milk, coagulating tofu from scratch, sewing masks. Old school. 2. Newspaper headlines. Asian students say coronavirus is spreading discrimination at Michigan State University, Lansing State Journal. Coronavirus graffiti at park leaves Asian American woman scared, frustrated, Royal Oak Tribune. Local groups respond to aggression against the Asian community, WZZM Grand Rapids. 3. When I first came for grad school, the only thing I knew about Michigan was that this was where Vincent Chin was killed, and I was afraid. 27 years old, Chinese American, a bachelor party, a baseball bat. It's because of you, little, that we're out of work, said the white auto worker. These aren't the kind of men you send to jail, said the judge. All these years I've lived in Michigan, I've held it at arm's length, felt like I did not belong, waited for the day I can finally return home. Then I learned about all the people who came together across differences of race and ethnicity, demanding justice for Vincent Chin, the people who still speak out to defend others, the people who would craft a new answer to the question Vincent Chin's mother asked all those years ago. What kind of law is this? What kind of justice? 4. More newspaper headlines. Chinese Americans in Michigan donate more than 200,000 masks, supplies. Detroit Free Press. Michigan leaders encourage reporting of anti-Asian American hate crimes amid COVID-19. WWMT West Michigan. Opinion. Hate has no home in Michigan, especially in coronavirus crisis. Bridge Magazine. 5. As the hashtags surge, stop AAPI hate, wash the hate, I am not a virus, hate is a virus, stand against hatred. And Big Gretch starts trending. I feel for the first time in all these years, like I belong here, like I am not alone here, like this can be home here. Even as the last snowstorm of the season sweeps in tomorrow. But in choosing to call this place home, we have to make this home for all of us, all our communities. What will you do to craft new answers for community and solidarity? Thank you.
Frances, thank you for that powerful beginning. It is now time for a preview of the Asian Americans, and we'll discuss it on the other side. Well, certainly it is as moving as it is powerful, and those of us who were in Detroit during the time remember the horrifying circumstances of the Vincent Chin case. We're going to have more of this preview coming up at the conclusion of this event. Once again, welcome in. Hi, I'm Fred Nahat from Detroit. This celebration and reflection of the many Asian American communities that call Detroit their home will continue on with our introduction now of the esteemed panelists we have assembled. Our great thanks in advance for their participation in alphabetical order. I'd like to introduce to you Melissa Borja, who is the Assistant Professor of American Culture at the University of Michigan. Ronald Hwang, American Citizens for Justice and Vice President for Public Affairs, OCA, Asian Pacific American advocates. Anand Kumar, Asian Indian community leader, president of MIIndia.com. Toshiki Masaki, chair, Michigan Asian Pacific Affairs Commission. Richard Mui, president of the board, APIAVote Michigan. Jim Shimoura, past president, American Citizens for Justice. And Helen Zia, nationally renowned author of Asian American Dreams, The Emergence of an American People. Great thanks to all of you for joining us. And now I'd like to welcome in and turn over the moderation of this event to the award-winning senior producer of Detroit Public TV's One Detroit Hero and quite a filmmaker himself, Bill Kovat. Bill, to you, sir.
Well, thanks, Fred. Obviously, when you talk about Asian Americans and Detroit, it really comes back to almost 40 years ago with the Vincent Chin murder. And today we've got three of the key people involved, three of many, but some of the most prominent people involved with that whole affair and bringing that story to light to the rest of the country. Helen Zia, Jim Shimoura, Roland Hwang. So we want to start talking with them a little bit. Helen, I know there's a lot more to add to the story you saw with the PBS documentary, but where are we now with Asian American affairs and how has that affected maybe Detroit? I know you haven't been here in a while, but certainly you're keeping up with things. What do you think?
Well, first, let me just say how wonderful it is to join my friends, neighbors, colleagues, coworkers from the Detroit area, because I did live in Detroit for a number of years, including this time of the collapse of the auto industry. And many things have happened to Asian Americans over the years. When the Vincent Chin tragedy happened, there were less than 5 million Asian Americans, maybe just a few million Asian Americans in the whole country. Today, there are 20 million. We've really advanced in many, many areas. We are now in every part of the country. But sadly, that was a time when there was terrible misery, a depression in the Midwest and a recession throughout the entire country, and Japan was being blamed. So here we find ourselves today, where we are looking right into the jaws of a depression. You know, nobody wants to say that yet, but 33 million people have been marked the official unemployment rate. And from our experience in Michigan, we know that there's actually many, many more people who are suffering and who are not being counted throughout the United States and really, frankly, the world. And on top of the terrible financial economic crisis that households are facing today, there's also the specter of illness and death. And certainly Michigan and the Detroit area have been hit very hard with that. So what we remember from then is that when people are suffering terribly, they're upset, they're angry, they're looking for an outlet, and they can be misled into blaming an entire group of people, an entire race of people. That happened in the 1980s with Vincent Chin, who was Chinese, but anybody who looked Japanese and really anybody Asian, yellow or brown, was a target. And we're facing that today as well, where the finger of blame is being pointed at China, even from our highest leadership, or what I call, frankly, the white supremacy house. But in those days, the CEOs of every major auto company, the halls of Congress, were all saying, let's drop a bomb, another atomic bomb on Japan, and talking about eliminating, killing, an entire race of people. And unfortunately, as much as things have changed for Asian Americans in these last almost 40 years, sometimes it's one step forward, two steps back. And I'm afraid we find ourselves in a very similar time today as we were looking at back in the 1980s with the Vincent Chin murder.
Thanks. when we started working on this project here, putting this town hall together, COVID-19 wasn't even anywhere near our sites. And one of the people we were talking to a lot was Jim Shimoura, an attorney back then, still an attorney now. But Jim, what do you think about this whole situation, looking back in this case and how it affected Asian Americans back in the 80s? And did it activate Asian Americans?
Well, first, I'd like to thank DPTV for organizing this event. And it's would have been much nicer to have a large scale event, but with the technology, it allows us to at least discuss this in a very meaningful way by having the forum. So I appreciate the opportunity. When looking at that clip from the documentary, it reminds you of a bad rerun of a movie from 40 years ago. What the elements you see then exist now. You have xenophobia. You have a society which is looking for scapegoats to blame for the current economic and health crisis. And in many ways, if you know, the rhetoric may have changed a bit. You don't have the car bashing and whatnot. The same kind of activity is going on through social media. And as Helen put all the way to the, I'll leave it, just that clown in the White House, leave it at that. So as a result, there's been a legitimization of the scapegoating, the kinds of racial motivation, which was the backdrop of Vincent Chin being killed 40 years ago, is being repeated right now. And what I find very disappointing is that there's been little, if any, outcry by our political leadership, industry, unions, and people that are true opinion leaders to speak out about this. So this leads to these things like the blocking of the state legislature, over 1,000 incidents of APAs being attacked on racial motivation, and also a legitimization of almost like white supremacy, which has really been using this opportunity as a way of galvanizing their own movement as well. It's very scary for me. After going through this 40 years ago, I thought society would have progressed. But if you look at history going back over a century, every time there's a crisis, you need to find a scapegoat. You need to find an excuse to try to deflect public opinion and attitudes towards the real cause. And for me, it's a very sad state of affairs. Unfortunately, as a person who's lived through, several decades of this, it's a little bit disheartening realizing you worked very hard on a movement. You think you've made progress, and all of a sudden you get set back to a time almost 40 years ago as far as a public dialogue. To me, that's very disappointing and quite frankly, makes me very angry.
Jim, I know a lot of us talk a lot about this, but Roland, we look back to the motivations and the activations of the 80s and Asian Americans, and it's different now, but what is it going on now with Asian Americans? Is there a cohesiveness here in our community in Detroit? What do you think?
Well, thank you, Bill. I just figure that back then, the Asian American communities operated in their own, realms, their own churches, organizations, that sort of thing. But they came together to fight for a common cause, and that's civil rights and justice for Vincent Chin. And I think that now is the opportunity to sort of replicate the situation that Asian Americans are coming together in coalitions now and working with other civil rights organizations to fight a common cause now, and that's against xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and just the racism that's always under the surface, but rears its ugly head whenever there's an excuse for racism to occur.
Thanks, Roland. Yesterday we ran another segment about Asian Americans here in Detroit. I produced, so we can show you that, talking about relating this Chin case, like we all are, to the COVID-19 crisis. So as Warner Wolf says, let's go to the videotape or digital file.
Hang on, let me bring it up for you guys.
Hey, Billy, if you can pepper in there, if there is any questions for the audience, yeah, we'll take them at the end.
Sure.
Hold on. I'm going to play it from the Zoom. So here we go.
A few decades ago, some Asians feared coming to the Motor City. They knew about the murder of Vincent Chin.
The job is a job. In the television news, you know, you're kind of a peripatetic soul, go from town to town looking for work.
Tiwa Chang grew up in New York. He'd been reporting in Denver. Then he got a job here at Channel 2.
But then coming to Detroit, you know, it was at first scary. And I know when I came to Detroit, I think the statute of limitations had passed, but I had a gun in my car. Eventually, I stopped doing that because I realized it was illegal in Michigan. But so when I got to the Detroit area, the first week, I had dinner with Mrs. Chin.
You know how they killed my son? The father hit him in the head.
This was the time where Asian Americans were starting to become more visible, and you were kind of watching that happen here in the city of Detroit.
Well, I think what happened was the Vincent Chin movement galvanized and helped create an Asian American movement, or recreate it. There was an Asian American movement against the Vietnam War in 1970, but this was the first time since then that there was an Asian American movement. At the time, there was a recession, and the auto industry was collapsing because the American cars were not made very well, and the Japanese cars were being made better, and they were selling better, and they blamed the Japanese. They saw Vincent, they thought he was Japanese. So that was helped create an Asian American movement in 1983 and 84. And of course, you have to credit Helen Zia, Jim Shimoura, Roland, Hwang, Henry Yee, these different people who were very, very active in helping fight for Mrs. Chin.
In San Francisco, the Stop AAPI Hate Project has been collecting incidents against Asians since the pandemic began. The anger at Asians? Then it was Michigan, now it's everywhere.
We launched the center in March, collecting data on news accounts, because that's the only documentation news stories. And so we did content analysis for about a month or 2 months of news stories. And then we got a flood of responses.
When you started getting those responses, what did you think?
They're pretty horrific. We're getting, yelled at, racial slurs, kids and elderly present. So it's actually really wearing reading all these reports, over and over again of how much hate there is. But we're getting it from all over the place. Places that are more dense and where people use a lot of public transit, we see a lot more physical assault. So, for example, New York and San Francisco have twice the rate of physical assault than, let's say, Los Angeles and the national average. People can be more anonymous in big cities. Even in liberal, progressive towns like San Francisco, you still see this hate.
Here, incidences reported in Ann Arbor and some other places in that database, a lot of verbal harassment. In Troy, State Representative Padma Kupa has some reports too.
Some friends have mentioned to me that they have seen people give them the finger or spit on them as they've taken walks in their neighborhood. I have a friend who's shared with me, a friend of hers daughter was on a Zoom call. The child is 7, and one of her classmates said, "I hate the Chinese. They started the coronavirus. It's the Chinese virus."
China poisoned our people. President Trump has the courage to call it what it is.
The Chinese virus.
Kathleen Wall has his back.
We've got a long way to go till November, and it sounds like this may really be one of the main campaign points that we're going to hear from here on out.
It is. It's Biden also put out an ad that he's strong on China.
Trump praised the Chinese 15 times as the coronavirus spread across the world.
So it's both parties. U.S.-China relations is going to be a primary campaign issue. And the more people hear politicians China bashing, don't make the distinction between the Chinese government and the Chinese people. And then people don't make the distinction between Chinese people and Chinese in the U.S.
And the fact is, look, if you attack China, This is, just think back to the Vincent Chin time. It's so much a parallel, except in a bigger way. It's a parallel because back in 1982, we blamed somebody else for our problems, for our inability to manufacture well. And instead of retooling as we have now and saying, let's make better cars, and let's say to Japan, listen, you want our business? You got to set up business here too.
Remember the Honda plant in Ohio, Toyota in Kentucky? Attitudes change.
Basically,
Tiwa Chang now covering climate change for the Young Turks.
and there's so much oil
He suggests
out there.
industry worldwide needs change for everyone's survival, and that we work with the Chinese.
We can do the same thing with China. Say, listen, you want our business? Set up more factories here. Do more joint ventures here.
We're fighting two things, a depression and a virus. We shouldn't be fighting each other.
All right, stand by. We're good. Go ahead, Fred.
Well, certainly it is as moving as it is powerful. And those of us who were in Detroit during the time, remember the horrifying circumstances of the Vincent Chin case. We're going to have more of this preview coming up at the conclusion of this event. Once again, welcome in. Hi, I'm Fred Nahat from Detroit. This celebration and reflection of the many Asian American communities that call Detroit their home will continue on with our introduction now of the esteemed panelists we have assembled. Our great thanks in advance for their participation in alphabetical order. I'd like to introduce to you Melissa Borja, who's the Assistant Professor of American Culture at the University of Michigan. Ronald Hwang, American Citizens for Justice and Vice President for Public Affairs, OCA, Asian Pacific American Advocates. Anand Kumar, Asian Indian Community Leader, President of MIIndia.com. Toshiki Masaki, Chair, Michigan Asian Pacific Affairs Commission. Richard Mui, President of the Board, APIAVote Michigan. Jim Shimoura, past President, American Citizens for Justice. And Helen Zia, nationally renowned author of Asian American Dreams, The Emergence of an American People. Great thanks to all of you for joining us. And now I'd like to welcome in and turn over the moderation of this event to the award-winning senior producer of Detroit Public TV's One Detroit Hero and quite a filmmaker himself, Bill Kovat. Bill, to you, sir.
Well, thanks, Fred. Obviously, when you talk about Asian Americans and Detroit, it really comes back to almost 40 years ago with the Vincent Chin murder. And today we've got three of the key people involved, three of many, but some of the most prominent people involved with that whole affair and bringing that story to light to the rest of the country. Helen Zia, Jim Shimoura, Roland Hwang. So we want to start talking with them a little bit. Helen, I know there's a lot more to add to the story you saw with the PBS documentary, but where are we now with the Asian American affairs and how has that affected maybe Detroit? I know you haven't been here in a while, but certainly you're keeping up with things. What do you think?
Well, first, let me just say how wonderful it is to join my friends, neighbors, colleagues, coworkers from the Detroit area, because I did live in Detroit for a number of years, including this time. collapse of the auto industry. And many things have happened to Asian Americans over the years. When the Vincent Chin tragedy happened, there were less than 5 million Asian Americans, maybe just a few million Asian Americans in the whole country. Today, there are 20 million. We've really advanced in many, many areas. We are now in every part of the country. But sadly, that was a time when there was terrible misery, a depression in the Midwest, and a recession throughout the entire country, and Japan was being blamed. So here we find ourselves today, where we are looking right into the jaws of a depression. You know, nobody wants to say that yet, but 33 million people have been marked the official unemployment rate. And from our experience in Michigan, we know that there's actually many, many more people who are suffering and who are not being counted throughout the United States and really, frankly, the world. And on top of the terrible financial economic crisis that households are facing today, there's also the specter of illness and death. And certainly Michigan and the Detroit area have been hit very hard with that. So what we remember from then is that when people are suffering terribly, they're upset, they're angry, they're looking for an outlet, and they can be misled into blaming an entire group of people, an entire race of people that happened in the 1980s with Vincent Chin, who was Chinese, but anybody who looked Japanese and really anybody Asian, yellow or brown, was a target. And we're facing that today as well, where the finger of blame is being pointed at China, even from our highest leadership, or what I call, frankly, the white supremacy house. But in those days, the CEOs of every major auto company, the halls of Congress, were all saying, let's drop a bomb, another atomic bomb on Japan, and talking about eliminating, killing, an entire race of people. And unfortunately, as much as things have changed for Asian Americans in these last almost 40 years, sometimes it's one step forward, two steps back. And I'm afraid we find ourselves in a very similar time today as we were looking at back in the 1980s with the Vincent Chin murder.
Thanks. When we started working on this project here, putting this town hall together, COVID-19 wasn't even anywhere near our sites. And one of the people we were talking to a lot was Jim Shimoura, an attorney back then, still an attorney now. But Jim, what do you think about this whole situation, looking back in this case and how it affected Asian Americans back in the 80s? And did it activate Asian Americans?
Well, first, I'd like to thank DPTV for organizing this event. And would have been much nicer to have a large scale event, but with the technology, it allows us to at least discuss this in a very meaningful way by having the forum. So I appreciate the opportunity. When looking at that clip from the documentary, it reminds you of a bad rerun of a movie from 40 years ago. What the elements you see then exist now. You have xenophobia. You have a society which is looking for scapegoats to blame for the current economic and health crisis. And in many ways, if the rhetoric may have changed a bit, you don't have the car bashing and whatnot. The same kind of activity is going on through social media, and as Helen put, all the way to the, I'll leave it just that clown in the White House. Leave it as that. So as a result, there's been a legitimization of the scapegoating, the kinds of racial motivation, which was the backdrop of Vincent Chin being killed 40 years ago, is being repeated right now. And what I find very disappointing is that there's been little, if any, outcry by our political leadership, industry, unions, and people that are true opinion leaders to speak out about this. So this leads to these things like the blocking of the state legislature, over 1,000 incidents of APAs being attacked on racial motivation, and also a legitimization of almost like white supremacy, which has really been using this opportunity as a way of galvanizing their own movement as well. It's very scary. For me, after going through this 40 years ago, I thought society would have progressed. But if you look at history going back over a century, every time there's a crisis, you need to find a scapegoat. You need to find an excuse to try to deflect public opinion and attitudes towards a real cause. And for me, it's a very sad state of affairs. Unfortunately, as a person who's lived through, several decades of this, it's a little bit disheartening realizing you worked very hard on a movement. You think you've made progress, and all of a sudden you get set back to a time almost 40 years ago as far as a public dialogue. To me, that's very disappointing and quite frankly, makes me very angry.
Jim, I know a lot of us talk a lot about this, but Roland, we look back to the motivations and the activations of the 80s and Asian Americans, and it's different now, but what is it going on now with Asian Americans? Is there a cohesiveness here in our community in Detroit? What do you think?
Well, thank you, Bill. I just figure that back then, the Asian American communities operated in their own, realms, their own churches, organizations, that sort of thing. But they came together to fight for a common cause, and that's civil rights and justice for Vincent Chin. And I think that now is the opportunity to sort of replicate the situation that Asian Americans are coming together in coalitions now and working with other civil rights organizations to fight a common cause now, and that's against xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and just the racism that's always under the surface, but rears its ugly head whenever there's an excuse for racism to occur.
Thanks, Roland. Yesterday we ran another segment about Asian Americans here in Detroit. I produced, so we can show you that, talking about relating this Chin case, like we all are, to the COVID-19 crisis. So as Warner Wolf says, let's go to the videotape.
A few decades ago, some Asians feared coming to the Motor City. They knew about the murder of Vincent Chin.
A job is a job. In the television news, you're kind of a peripatetic soul, go from town to town looking for work.
Tiwa Chang grew up in New York. He'd been reporting in Denver. Then he got a job here at Channel 2.
But then coming to Detroit, it was at first scary. And I know when I came to Detroit, I think the statute of limitations had passed, but I had a gun in my car. Eventually I stopped doing that because I realized it was illegal in Michigan. But so when I got to the Detroit area, the first week I had dinner with Mrs. Chin.
You know how they killed my son? The father hit him in the head.
This was the time where Asian Americans were starting to become more visible, and you were kind of watching that happen here in the city of Detroit.
Well, I think what happened was the Vincent Chin movement galvanized and helped create an Asian American movement, or recreate it. There was an Asian American movement against the Vietnam War in 1970, but this was the first time since then that there was an Asian American movement. At the time, there was a recession, and the auto industry was collapsing because the American cars were not made very well, and the Japanese cars were being made better, and they were selling better, and they blamed the Japanese. They saw Vincent, they thought he was Japanese. So that was helped create an Asian American movement in 1983 and 84. And of course, you have to credit Helen Zia, Jim Shimoura, Roland, Hwang, Henry Yee, these different people who were very, very active in helping fight for Mrs. Chin.
In San Francisco, the Stop AAPI Hate Project has been collecting incidents against Asians since the pandemic began. The anger at Asians? Then it was Michigan, now it's everywhere.
We launched the center in March, collecting data on news accounts, because that's the only documentation news stories. And so we did content analysis for about a month or 2 months of news stories. And then we got a flood of responses.
When you started getting those responses, what did you think?
They're pretty horrific. We're getting, yelled at, racial slurs, kids and elderly present. So it's actually really wearing reading all these reports, over and over again of how much hate there is. But we're getting it from all over the place. Places that are more dense and where people use a lot of public transit, we see a lot more physical assault. So for example, New York and San Francisco have twice the rate of physical assault than, let's say, Los Angeles and the national average. People can be more anonymous in big cities. Even in liberal, progressive towns like San Francisco, you still see this hate.
Here, incidences reported in Ann Arbor and some other places in that database, a lot of verbal harassment. In Troy, State Representative Padma Kupa has some reports too.
Some friends have mentioned to me that they have seen people give them the finger or spit on them as they've taken walks in their neighborhood. I have a friend who's shared with me, a friend of hers daughter was on a Zoom call. The child is 7 and one of her classmates said, "I hate the Chinese. They started the coronavirus. It's the Chinese virus."
China poisoned our people. President Trump has the courage to call it what it is.
The Chinese virus.
Kathleen Wall has his back.
We've got a long way to go till November, and it sounds like this may really be one of the main campaign points that we're going to hear from here on out.
It is. It's Biden also put out an ad that he's strong on China.
Trump praised the Chinese 15 times as the coronavirus spread across the world.
So it's both parties. U.S.-China relations is going to be a primary campaign issue. And the more people hear politicians China bashing, don't make the distinction between the Chinese government and the Chinese people. And then people don't make the distinction between Chinese people and Chinese in the U.S.
And the fact is, look, if you attack China, this is, just think back to the Vincent Chin time. It's so much a parallel, except in a bigger way. It's a parallel because back in 1982, we blamed somebody else for our problems, for our inability to manufacture well. And instead of retooling as we have now and saying, let's make better cars, and let's say to Japan, listen, you want our business, you got to set up business here too.
Remember the Honda plant in Ohio, Toyota in Kentucky? Attitudes change.
Basically,
Tiwa Chang now covering climate change for the Young Turks.
And there's so much oil.
He suggests industry worldwide needs change for everyone's survival, and that we work with the Chinese.
We can do the same thing with China. Say, listen, you want our business? Set up more factories here. Do more joint ventures here.
We're fighting two things, depression and a virus. We shouldn't be fighting each other.
Okay. Hey, if you're watching this, if you got any questions, please write them in. One of the things we look at with the harassment around here and the crisis, I wanted to talk to Melissa about that a little bit. You're connected with the Stop API Hate. Do you think people are reporting these incidents enough? And do you think people are stepping up things like the census and voting? Are Asians getting afraid to participate in society the way it's going on right now?
Well, to answer your first question, yes, people are reporting. In the first 4 weeks of the self-reporting hate incident form that was featured in the little clip that you showed, Stop API Hate received almost 1,500 reports of harassment. And these reports came from 45 states across the country. We found that women were twice as likely to be harassed as men. We are seeing these reports range in severity, some including acts of violence, some verbal harassment. But yes, people are reporting and people are speaking up and organizing against this issue, which is why we have Stop API Hate project in the first place.
Richard Moy, what do you think about all of that in your role at the APIAVote?
Well, thank you for having me on today. Well, I would say one of the legacies I think of the Vincent Chin case is that you need to remain vigilant and you need to be organized, so that when this incident something like the coronavirus shows up again, we're always just one crisis away from becoming a scapegoat. So I think in the state of Michigan, Attorney General Nessel has done a fantastic job, and with Senator Chang and Representative Kupa, of making sure the community is aware. And we just had a virtual town hall, I think it was like a week or so ago. And the main message out of that was report, report, report. And so, it's easy to dismiss that you think it's just kids being kids or they won't take you seriously, but it is important to document all these incidents so that we can get a fuller picture of what's happening. And, again, the numbers have increased. And I think in part of APIAVote, we are trying to make sure that people are politically engaged and civically engaged. That's diversity is our strength and unity is our power. That we need to, we have a common fate together, and so we need to work together to, to make sure the legislators and people in power look out for us.
Let's talk to Toshiki Masaki, president of the Michigan Asian Pacific American Affairs Commission, MAPAAC, focusing on the needs and concerns of Asian Americans. At this point in our history, what do you think the major needs and concerns of the local community are?
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Sorry, very happy to be on this panel. So before I answer that question, I do want to say that not everything is doom and gloom, right? Because we have two distinguished Asian Pacific American legislators in the state legislature, Senator Chang and Representative Kumar. And one of the legacy of Vincent Chin incidents is the MAPAAC. Now, it started initially as a governor's advisory board, but then later was codified by the law, and which turns out to be we're one of 5 or only 6 states that does this, and we have the budget and staff to support the commission. And then one of the things we do with MAPAAC is to have a 60 of Asian Pacific American organizations, all nonprofit, and serving their communities. And we work with them and we celebrate our achievement together as well. So in terms of the need, I don't think our communities' needs are any different from any other immigrant communities. When they come here looking for better economic opportunities, so we need to help them settle in. And of course, when incidents like this happens, it's no help for them to get situated. But this is where we have to educate them that there are resources available to help them make an advancement. And that's one of the primary missions for MAPAAC.
Thanks, Toshiki. We're talking now with Anand Kumar. South Asians, a lot of South Asians in Michigan since the time of the killing of Vincent Chin. It's hard to boil this down, but it's the largest Asian American population around here. Tell us a little bit about this more recent history of South Asians in the Detroit area.
Sure, Bill. Thank you. Thank you for having me here. The real revolution started with the digital transformation back in 1999. Number of our Indian technology professionals moved into the area. If you recall, the Y2K issue was a big deal about 20 years ago. And once they came in, the digital economy has really flourished over the years, and it continues to impact every aspect of our lives. So that kind of laid the foundation for several thousand of our Indian residents moving into the area.
Well, where I live, Troy, my state representative is Padma Kupa, who came here working on that Y2K situation. She's actually born here, was Indian, came back, and now she's part of this new, I guess, political base that we're looking at. But let's talk in general, kind of opening it up to everybody. Let's talk about some more about this whole situation with the Vincent Chin incident and where we are today. What really is different? We can talk about the economics, but so surprising that us facing a major recession, maybe even a depression here, we're looking at the same thing once again. And like Jim Shimoura said, it sounds like we've gone back. And I know we've heard that already, but I'd like to hear some other voices on that. Anybody want to jump in there?
I'd like to
Go
suggest
ahead, Roland.
coalition building remains the cornerstone for action. We look to coalition building back in the time of the Vincent Chin case, seeking support of New Detroit, NAACP, Detroit Association of Black Organizations. The landscape is similar now to the extent that we've called upon civil rights organizations, AARP, ACLU, and many other organizations, ADL, to help support the movement now and to document situations as they arise and to get the word out that what's happening on the street is not, not a good fact, not permissible.
Helen, I know that you're on the West Coast now, but I think that's a better perspective in some ways to just see our national, the national point of view and maybe the Detroit point of view. Maybe we're just a lot more like everybody else now. Detroit isn't so unique anymore. What do you think?
Well, in the context of what's going on, I definitely think that Detroit is very much like the rest of the country. And really, we know that this pandemic of anti-Asian racism is going on around the world. But, I would like to sort of jump on what Roland was saying about, coming together and addressing these things, because one of the legacies of the Vincent Chin case that came out of Detroit and really made Detroit a special place then, and I think now too, was how people came together. This was not just a hate crime that affected the Asian American community. Actually, the entire greater Detroit and Michigan was not only aware of the injustice that took place, but they saw the clear racial impact and overtones of saying that these two white men should be out free for killing a man, and that they weren't the kind of men to send to jail. And so, what did that really mean about who you send to jail in a city like Detroit? And really, the reason that Asian Americans were able to make this into a national movement was also we had the support of the Detroit Black organization, Detroit area Black organizations, the Urban League, the NAACP, as well as the Anti-Defamation League, the Arab American groups, every religious organization you can think of in the Detroit area, as well as gay and lesbian organizations, women's groups. I mean, this was truly a multiracial, multi-class, multicultural effort that came together in Detroit. And that is really one of the things we can really learn today about doing this, not only on a national scale. We know that the virus knows no boundaries. We are going to take everybody to make change. And in Detroit at that time, out of that came a whole legacy that benefited every person, not only in Michigan, but in the whole country. The whole idea of a victim being able to have their family come forward at a trial and say, this is how I was harmed. Vincent's family was denied that. Actually, nobody in Michigan could do that at the time. And out of that came victim impact statements that the Me Too movement for women against sexual assault and sexual harassment has really reached the hearts of people. The whole idea that a prosecutor should show up at sentencing didn't happen until the Vincent Chin case. And of course, hate crimes protection laws that exist, in many locations and states and in the country were expanded the whole view out of the Vincent Chin case, because before then, the idea that Asian Americans and immigrants might not be protected by federal civil rights law. And these things and more only happened because people came together. So I think when we look at that time and the legacy of the Vincent Chin case, it really goes beyond Asian Americans. And this spate of anti-Asian hatred going on around the world is so misplaced because, as other speakers have said, it's going to take all of us to overcome the challenges that we have, and fighting each other is not going to lead us anywhere. In fact, it's going to hurt all of us.
Hey, Jim, it looked like maybe you wanted to say something there. Am I wrong?
Hang on.
I caught you off guard. Sorry about that.
Well, really, the political dynamic to combat racism and the xenophobia today is really, as Helen mentioned earlier, no different than it was almost 40 years ago. One thing I think is unfortunate over time, and again, partially because of changes in society, and also I think social media has a lot to do with it, you're getting compartmentalization of groups to the point where everybody has their silo and they remain in that, and that becomes your reality. And the fact is, as you mentioned earlier, the racism and disease cross all lines. And I think there needs to be a recognition that each of us have our own individual and community interests, but at the same time, there's a common issue that has to be addressed. And it starts with realizing that all of us are in the same boat, so to speak, as far as being a target. Not just Asians, I think any person of color right now is being targeted, and either directly or else you're not being properly serviced. For example, I think a lot of the food workers, which are primarily minorities, are getting horribly treated right now because they're not getting protection. They're not getting the kind of attention that is required during the current pandemic. Add to that the racial aspect, which is being stoked by the White House. It's a very deadly combination. And I think the time is now to get dialogue open, to have coalitions built and rebuilt in order to combat this. Otherwise, I think we're looking at a very long and very torturous path ahead.
You know, what Helen was saying earlier, and you look at that film from Who Killed Vincent Chin that we excerpted a little bit on the short piece that I made, it wasn't just Asians marching there. And in recent years, I've been covering Latinos, Arab Americans, and I wonder if we're feeling the embrace of the other minority groups around. I don't know if minority is the right term these days, but around this town, is there that cohesion? And the South Asians tying in with the other Asian Americans. Where are we on this really? What do you all think about that?
If I may just jump in here, I want to give a little bit of background on myself. I was actually born in 1982 in Saginaw, just a couple hours north of Detroit, 3 weeks before Vincent Chin was murdered. So the fact that I am currently an Asian American Studies professor at the University of Michigan doing work on anti-Asian hate work is the consequence of the organizing that took place in the 1980s. So I just really want to emphasize the legacy of that event. I have to emphasize the fear that Asian American families like my own family felt in the 1980s. I remember talking about that murder with my parents around the dinner table and feeling that pressure to fit in, feeling that pressure to stay quiet in certain ways, but also as I got older and more confident in who I am as an Asian American person, realized the importance of flexing my power and organizing and responding. So where does that bring us to the current moment, responding to anti-Asian hate right now? I think we can't underestimate the importance of solidarity we've seen with other communities. So a few examples. In late March, early April, we saw a lot of groups, Jewish American organizations, dozens of them, expressing solidarity with Asian Americans. We also saw a congressional resolution introduced by Congresswoman Grace Meng, that was supported by the Asian Caucus, but also the Black and Hispanic Caucus in the US House of Representatives. So yes, to some degree we are siloed, but I think one thing that makes this moment different is we have several generations of activists who have learned from that moment in 1982. We have many more community connections and expressions of solidarity than we ever have. And I think that there is a lot of possibility in the current moment.
I think I just want to say, I'm thinking I have a cousin who was active in, I think there were some events regarding, those kids from Mexico in cages. I know there's a movement among some Japanese Americans to get involved with that. Are Asians stepping up with the other groups too? What's going on there? What do y'all think about that? Francis, I suspect you might have something to say about that.
about the I wasn't expecting to be on the panel.
Well, you're
But,
here, so I thought I put you
yeah,
in there.
absolutely. I mean, there are, I would say, folks of color are finding the commonalities and are working together and realizing that we're all stronger together. Then there's a lot, especially the young people who are organizing. There is a lot of amazing, I would say, thought leadership coming out of the young people who are organizing across racial lines, across. I mean, it's. How do you begin? They're great. They're doing great work.
Sorry to do that to you, Francis. But
No, if I
Richard,
could- yeah.
I
If
think
I could jump
Richard,
in,
you
I-
might want to talk about that a little bit too, because a lot of it's
Yeah.
younger folks as well, right?
Yeah, and I think part of it is, I mean, that we need to educate the young folks, you know, to catch them up on the history. And so it's sometimes, I think, easy to think that it's always been this way and it'll just always continue to be this way, just in terms of the organization. But I think that takes effort. And part of that is going to, I mean, you need to remember what's happened before in the organizations, the organizing that has taken place before. And so one of the things I try to do with the students at my school, we have a Asian Pacific American Club. We go down to see the plaque dedicated to Vincent Chin down in Ferndale at 9 Mile Woodward. And so we make that a regular trip every year, just to kind of remind them that, you know, we're living in that legacy. And to your earlier question, I think it's a two-way street. So, you know, something that's timely now, the murder of the young man that was jogging in Georgia, the Arbery. We need to reach out. I think we need to reach out and support, you know, that movement as well, because it's eerily similar in terms of the Vincent Chin case. That here's someone that was, you know, that was murdered in daylight, and you know that was back in February. Nothing has happened until people saw the video. Well, I mean, enough people saw the video apparently. So I think it really is important. It's a two-way street. So not only that other groups, you know, support Asian Americans, but Asian American organizations also reach out across lines and support other movements as well.
Well, it's interesting you talk about age, but you're also looking at different waves of immigration. Anand, how do you think about that? Is the South Asian community activated as a group that's uniting with others?
Yeah, sure, Bill. Of course we are. I've served on the MAPAAC Commission for 2 terms. I work closely, and Roland knows this. We've had a few incidents of concern in our community, and the first person I called was Roland, and he gave me a lot of suggestions. You know, I just want to add a couple of points. One is, the thing that concerns me most is what I don't see, which is unconscious bias. And there could be, that could result in a flare-up at any time. So that unknown is something that concerns me a lot. And, you know, yearly, similar with the coronavirus, you know, you can't see it, you don't know where you touch something and you catch it and it hurts you. So the second point I do want to make is, you know, how we network. Social media and the internet communications has helped us immensely to partner with like-minded organizations and people cutting across ethnic backgrounds.
Melissa, it looked like you had something to say about that.
I didn't. It was actually something related to what Richard was saying about taking cues from younger generations and finding solidarities. I just want to say that I have been continually impressed and inspired by the student activists I encounter at the University of Michigan, who constantly are pushing Asian Americans in our university community to think about how Asian Americans are complicit in anti-Blackness, how Asian Americans can be and have been historically complicit in settler colonialism that has oppressed Native peoples. Thinking about also solidarities that we can have with Latin American migrants who are in cages at the border. And so I think that we need to learn from people who have worked in justice, social justice organizing before us. But I also think that there's a lot of really amazing work being done by young people today that older people can learn from.
Thank you for that. I guess, Fred, we've got some questions on the line here.
We do, and some of them are quite specific. So let's start out with a question for Anand Kumar, related to the previous question, but I think more specifically as to COVID-19. What do you think is the impact of COVID-19 on the South Asian community? That question is from Lena.
Thank you. Let me start off with the first impact was the fact that a number of students and seniors got cut off. As you know, number of universities here have foreign students, and a significant number of those are Indian. That got sorted out through the community, and so did the senior issue. The one that came as a total surprise is the frontline workers, and these are hospital employees that sacrifice not just their time, but their own personal health and those of their families. And I know of several that served on the front lines, not knowing what will happen to them. And so that came as a crisis, but we all got together, we communicate with each other, we help each other out on a daily basis, and manage the crisis as best as we can.
Fred, you got another question, Fred?
We do. Let's direct this one to Melissa. How do we deal with the anti-Asian sentiment we see online? I see it so much on social media sites like TikTok, yet every time someone tries to speak out, they get told, you can't take a joke, or it's not that serious. Melissa, your thoughts?
I'll be honest, I don't really know how TikTok works, even though my 11-year-old has been trying to convince me to learn this. But I will say this does raise an interesting question that we should all think about as organizers and people who are concerned about justice and equity for API people and beyond, which is the landscape is different now that we have the internet. You know, in 1980, we didn't have the same forum for expressing hate, but now the internet is a forum for expressing hate and also a space where people can organize very powerful, violent acts of hate. So I don't have great responses other than to take refuge in the reality that for every act or statement of hate we see online on social media, we see lots of amazing organizing taking place via social media too. So I think every time we see a comment like that, we can take the opportunity to try to find solidarity and continue to build connection using social media as a tool to advance our agenda.
Thank you.
Fred, I know there were a lot of people tuning in. Any other folks out there with some questions?
Yeah, there are some, a couple more. For Mr. Moy, do you feel like the president using inappropriate language such as the China virus makes other people feel like it's okay to do the same? And just to follow up, how do we counteract that?
Well, I think he's had pushback on it. And just to back up a little bit, I think you go back to the World Health Organization, they have purposely not associated diseases with localities or ethnicity for that very purpose, because it stigmatizes the groups. And it brings about, probably unwarranted and unnecessary discrimination and hate. And I was glad to see that there were reporters that pushed back on the president when he continually used that. And finally, he backed down. It looked like that, he stopped referring to it as the Chinese virus. But unfortunately, there's others in his administration. Secretary Pompeo continues to push the idea that it was created in a lab and purposely let out on the rest of the world. So I think that's unfortunate, and he should be held accountable for his administration and the words that come up, the words that come from his administration. And I think it contributes to the xenophobia that we see. So.
Got it. Thank you.
Let me ask one thing about that though. Toshiki and MAPAAC, how are people reacting to this whole thing with the president and his presumed attitude about all of this?
So I don't think I should speak on behalf of the entire MAPAAC, but the members are obviously troubled by the environment that he created, which is obviously driving divisiveness. But we're staying focused on educating the community on what constitutes hate crime and what perhaps does not, just protected under free speech. But regardless, we should, whenever we see an instance of hate, we should be documenting and reporting it, so to make sure that things don't escalate further. But I do want to say one other thing though. Ultimately, yes, the environment created is not helpful, but the person who act on it, individuals, are the ones who are ultimately responsible. So we should be, I don't necessarily want to be generalizing and sort of taking them off the hook, the people who act on it, taking them off the hook, because most of the overwhelming majority of the society is still good, and they're not, we're focusing on all these very minor individual acts, but most of the society is still very good.
Thanks.
Can I interject here, Fred? Just a point on this question.
Sure.
This is Helen.
Go, Helen.
Okay. I do. Hi. There's no question that when the top leadership of a country or any leaders send a message saying that it is some other group is to blame, they are basically opening the door. And in this case, it was kind of letting the whole, barn open. And we've seen in the past, after 9/11, President George W. Bush actually made a statement saying that Islamophobia is not going to be tolerated in America. And that sent a very strong message. Now, that did not end hate crimes to brown and Muslim and South Asian, Middle Eastern people. But it did send a message through his administration and through law enforcement and all of the mechanisms that exist to say that that would not be acceptable. What we're seeing here is quite the opposite. And naming China as a source of the virus, I mean, if anybody's interested, you can find out that there's actually lots of things going on right now and a whole nother strain that looks like it's coming from Europe. And that's why the people on the East Coast have been so severely affected. And I don't see anybody talking about boycotting Italian restaurants or pizza or attacking, Fiats or whatever. And that's the kind of, the difference. I mean, back in the Vincent Chin days, Volkswagen, a German-made car, also, was very popular and fuel efficient. Yet the finger was pointed at Japan, and people who looked Japanese were attacked. So we know that the swine flu actually came from North America. Some people say it started in San Diego. The Spanish flu started in the United States, and millions of people died from those flus. And so not only is it throwing people who look Chinese, the blame at them, but it's also just factually wrong. It's wrong. And unfortunately, it's really opening the gates for people who are angry and want to take it out on somebody. Even school children, where a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old, not Chinese, Asian American, were stabbed in Texas and will have scars on their faces for the rest of their lives. Why? This happened right after the China virus statement from the White House happened. And so did a spike of hundreds of reports. So the reporting is important, but not just to be documented. It's also to hold our officials, our elected officials, our law enforcement, our government responsible for making sure that these acts that are illegal acts, that they don't take place. But really, it has to start with setting the example of saying we're all in this together. I mean, so many Asian Americans are first responders and healthcare workers, and people in their scrubs are getting attacked on their way to work in a hospital where they might be saving your mother or your family member. But why should they have to worry about being attacked? So yes, those words make a difference, and we have to stand up and say that they're not right.
Let me get Roland in here. Roland, the question is, and thank you, Helen. We want to make sure, the question is, we want to make sure that when we address anti-Asian harassment, we are ensuring our response is intersectional. What efforts do you see that are being done to help train Asian Americans to become leaders in government at local and national levels?
Well, I want to make note of the national organizations that are involved in this discourse. The Japanese American Citizens League and OCA have their respective pulpits to spread the word about what is the right way of speaking about the pandemic, and don't use the word China virus. They've called upon the Trump administration to stop using those terms. And so there is a place for the national organizations that represent the Asian American community to speak out, and they've been pretty effective in doing that. Yeah, that's the main point.
Fred, can I jump in on that question? So I think part of the response is, well, that Asian Americans need to be involved in the legislative process. And so APIAVote, along with MAPAAC, has co-sponsored an APA legislative day up this year. Obviously, was canceled due to the situation. But I think you have to be registered to vote. You have to follow the political discourse, and you have to get involved, and you have to advocate for issues that you care about. And not that we all care about or have the same views on every issue. But I think you need to familiarize yourself with the democratic process. That's important, whether you were born in America or you immigrated here, that's how democracy works. And I forgot who mentioned it earlier, but our numbers have increased, dramatically. And in a place like Michigan, where the last presidential election was decided by 10,000 votes, that's going to make a difference. So, be involved and stay involved.
Richard, thank you. Next question. Let me direct this to Jim Shimoura. Unconscious bias lurks in the general public, ready to surface at any moment. Our political leaders seem to understand this and exploit it for their own benefit. How do we make these leaders accountable for using race to divide and conquer?
Well, most importantly, you have to make them aware of the impact their statements have. Words have consequences, sometimes deadly. And unfortunately, the way the media operates, and obviously I'm not a media person, but it's very obvious, the news cycle is very short. People make these blasts and it has a long lasting effect, even though it may be off the airways because of social media and the like. It's important that civil rights organizations, and as we mentioned earlier, coalesce with mainstream media, working with political leaders, business leaders, to speak out and to try to combat this any way possible. I know that we've had anecdotal stuff go on by members of Congress and the like, but there has to be more of a concerted effort to bring this to the forefront. And I think the one thing that we learned from the Chin case 40 years ago is that you have to have a focus and an ability to bring forces together to combat the message. And that's something I think that could really be, a goal that has to be ascribed to by all organizations, groups across all lines to combat this. Right now, as I said before, Asians have been the target before, but next week it'd be anti-Semitic activity, anti-Arabic, anti-whatever, anti-Hispanic for that matter, in terms of the way the political dialogue is going to go forward. So it's important right now for us to reach out and build these bridges, and not that they didn't exist already, but to how to strengthen them and reinforce them to have a unified message. Because right now there's been a lot being spewed out by certain people that has dominated the headlines. And I think there has to be a way to combat that. And it starts now by events like this, where we can at least start the dialogue and to build around that as a flashpoint.
Well, thank you. Bill Kovat, let me bring you in on that question as a person who spent his life in the media and creating stories and narratives. We don't do advocacy journalism at PBS, but what is our role? Where should we stand and how should we reflect the news stories coming in when, after all, at the end of the day, the quote is the quote?
Well, it's interesting. I was going to ask that question of the group here, how the media is doing. It's when I thought it was interesting to talk to Tiwa Chang, who was back here in the 80s. he came after Vincent Chin was killed, but got involved with the movement. He didn't report on it because he was, that'd be kind of like, as an advocate, he couldn't really do that. But it raises a question of representation of who's in the media, who's paying attention. We're all looking for stories, but I kind of wonder here, even looking around and figuring out what was happening here, I know in talking, Christy McDonald talked to Roland and Richard about this. The incident reports didn't seem to be that big. People are all kind of staying home now, but we're trying to figure out what the stories are. And then they go on the air and then they go away and you wonder what they did. And some resonate, some get lost. And that's why I'm curious what other folks think. I think we got to do as much coverage as we can. A story is still a story. And whether it's Arab Americans or Latinos or Chaldeans, all these folks in this town that are being affected by what's going on is important. But I'm curious to see what some of you think about the coverage here in the city.
Let's get Toshiki Masaki in here. Toshiki, your general impression of the job the media is doing and reflecting the various stories on the current pandemic, and then Asian Americans and the population at large.
I think it's fortunate that the incidence rate, sort of hate incidents in this area hasn't been. I mean, we saw some incidents reported right at the beginning, but since then it seemed to have died down. And then obviously, I've asked all the commissioners and past commissioners, if they hear of incidents, please report us so we can forward it to the proper authorities within the state. And we haven't heard much about that. So, right, things are not. I'm pleasantly surprised and pleasantly optimistic that at least in this region, it hasn't been as bad as some other regions. So that's one of the reasons why I don't think we have seen much reporting on this issue here.
All right, Melissa, could you weigh in on that? Your general impressions of the media, how they are doing and reflecting the facts of the various issues on the table?
I'm glad you're asking this question because I'm just in the final stages of finishing a report that assesses how the news media has been covering the issue of anti-Asian hate. So a couple things I would like to highlight. First of all, news media coverage on the particular issue of COVID-related anti-Asian hate has increased over the 4-week period we studied between the beginning of March and the beginning of April. So I think that is a good sign that the media is paying attention to this issue. Another thing I want to emphasize, and it relates to another point that people had made, which is the significance of discourse and the impact that it has on the choices that people make. We have seen between the first week of March and the 4th week of March, really the first week of April, that period that we studied, a 400% increase in hate incidents involving adult harassment that were reported in the news. And during that time, that is when President Trump used language like China virus, Pompeo used the word Wuhan flu. And so I think we cannot ignore that relationship between the statements that our politicians are making and the documented rise in hate incidents reported in the news. So that is sort of a really important point. I see that a lot of people are saying, we're not hearing stories of people experiencing hate. But if you look at the national data, we know that there is an increase. And maybe we're not doing a good job of documenting that here in the state of Michigan. Maybe that's a sign that we need to do a better job of keeping track about what people's real experiences are on the ground.
Melissa, thank you. A couple more questions.
Can I chime in?
Please.
I think part of the issue is reporting. That is, people who are actually victims don't think they have enough information to bother to report incidents, not necessarily hate crimes, but those spitting incidents where people try to yank off masks, but there's no identification, no identifier that will allow it to move forward in terms of moving beyond just a statistic. And so I think a lot of that is lost as not being reported. And the community should know that really Department of Civil Rights, And the Attorney General's office takes interest not just in hate crimes, but in hate incidents.
Thank you. There's a question. And Helen, let me give this question to you. More spaces for Asian American women, and what's the women's movement within the overall movement, and what progress needs to be made there?
A question about the women's movement in.
Yeah, should there be?
I'm sorry.
Should there be more positive spaces for Asian? Is the question, and I think the reference is within the broader movement. What does progress for Asian American women look like specifically?
Well, that's a big question, but I will say I think Professor Borja mentioned some of the statistics, and with this current wave of anti-Asian hate, Asian American women are actually reporting getting attacked 2 to 1. And so for Asian American women, we haven't really delved in this conversation about the stereotypes of Asian Americans, and how we are defined by other people, really by the larger society that assigns racial stereotypes to groups. But for Asian Americans, one is either being the enemy, who is bent on destroying America, which this virus hatred fits in very well, or being the model minority that works like hell, like a coolie, but never complains and never expects, doesn't get paid equally or treated well. And so for Asian American women, the idea that they are the sort of exotic foreigner who is also passive and never complains because she's the model minority makes Asian American women in particular sort of the perfect target for people who are inclined to want to use their power to dominate and harass or even impose violence. And so I have to say that I'm not surprised that Asian American women in particular are finding 2 to 1 that they are being targeted. And even before this virus, with the Me Too movement, people who record issues of sexual harassment or sexual violence, many of the lawsuits have been, or crimes being reported are by Asian American women. So there really does need to be a space for Asian American women to actually feel like they will be taken seriously. I mean, this is a problem facing all Asian Americans, that we are pretty much invisible in society until a wave of violence or something brings attention our way. And within that, I mean, our communities aren't stagnant. So there are lots of organizations for Asian American women. If you look at the halls of Congress, we've elected so many more a record number of Asian American women, for national leadership, as well as I'm sure every locality where we are. But just as we're finding that the incidence of domestic violence worldwide has just skyrocketed because of all the sheltering in place, and for many women that means being with their abusers, we are also seeing that Asian American women have a particular have to be particularly, I think, on guard at this point. And we have to create spaces, whether it's in these kind of chat rooms, Zooms, town halls, and in our reporting, really to pay attention to what's happening to Asian American women. And as some of the other speakers pointed out, right now, this is happening when there is sheltering going on. I think there's a lot of concern and consternation about what happens when people are out and about, and that I think we're going to need special attention on this from the media, from our elected officials, from our law enforcement as well.
Helen, thank you. A quick follow-up for Roland. what are the avenues and channels for reporting hate incidents?
Well, locally, the Hate Crimes Unit of the Attorney General's Office has a hotline. It's 313-456-0200, and they will take the report. And certainly local law enforcement, they take reports. It's important to keep in mind the Department of Civil Rights. They count hate incidents. And so not necessarily those that rise to level hate crimes, but they're interested in the tally. So does that answer?
Yeah, thank you, Roland, for that. Is there any other resources or channels?
Can I add in there real quick?
Please.
The Asian Americans Advancing Justice is doing a great series of bystander intervention trainings with iHoloback. So you can go in and see how do you do intervention training and how do you safely, carefully step in and save someone if you see someone being harassed. A recent report at NBC News showed that 32% of Americans have witnessed incidents of anti-Asian violence, and here's your chance to be a part of the solution. And
if you, may I add that if you want to self-report and not go to law enforcement, because we also know that so many Asian Americans are maybe worried about how their immigration status could be affected, there's also hashtag Stop AAPI Hate. Stop AAPI Hate is the group that is collecting these 1,600 and counting self-reported incidents. So, so that's also another place people can report.
That is the group that my team is working with. So just want to make that connection.
I appreciate that. Bill Kubota, can I pull you in here for some additional or final thoughts?
No, I just was thinking, you know, around here, it makes you really think. Some of us, maybe I've been slighted in the past. You kind of get so used to looking past it, you don't really think about some of the things that might be directed at Asians. But I'm always thinking I'm okay. But then I hear from my kids who actually we adopted from China, and kind of worry, you know, they report things happening, and I'm kind of surprised. But I think for a lot of people, maybe my age, maybe we become more, I don't know, we're not looking at ourselves that way. That I think a lot more now we really need to step it up and pay better attention to things, because stuff is happening. We don't think about it much, but I guess it's time to be more aware. I guess that was what my take for me is on all of this. I don't see it's a big kick in the head here in Michigan. I forgot I'm Asian, you know, but I got to remind myself a little bit more, and then be aware that some people may have some, you know, some thoughts that aren't so pleasant about me here and there. But that's kind of my take here. So I know we got to wrap it up. We're running out of time, Fred.
Well, I would like to get a final word from each of our panelists, maybe on the subject of hope, and looking forward to the premiere of the film next week. Frances, could we start with you?
I think that for final thoughts, there's a lot of power in community and in making coalitions and finding commonalities across races, across ethnicities. And there's a lot of power and hope there.
Thank you so much, Frances. Roland, a final thought?
Well, people should realize that words matter, and when you hear hateful words, you should call them out on it. A lot of these interactions are just one-on-one, and I think individual responsibility for stepping up and addressing it is one way to go.
Roland, thank you. Helen, final word for our assemblage today?
Well, I think when I think of the large challenge that we all face, all of us as human beings, I also think about times we've overcome war, and I look to the last World War, and we look at the generations that lived through World War II as being the greatest generation. And why? Because they came together, they sacrificed to find a solution for everybody in the name of freedom, in the name of the common good. And that's what we're facing. And I think we can all look to other times and look to each other and say, you know what, we're capable of that too. We can rise to the challenge to be the greatest generations facing the biggest threats of this time. And it's going to take all of us. And as one of the speakers said, you know, we're fighting some big things. We don't need to be fighting each other. So we can do better. And we don't want to go back to normal. Normal, you know, was partly what led to these health disparities and racism and climate change and viruses. We want to do better than normal. We can create a better world. And that's the opportunity we have here, to be a great generation that builds a better world for tomorrow.
Helen, important words in a powerful moment. Thank you so much for that. Richard Mui, thanks for being with us. A final word and thought from you.
Yeah, I think it's just, I think the series Asian Americans it's a great chance to tell our story. And hopefully everybody tunes into that, and you can appreciate, I think, how far we've come and maybe how far we still have to go. But it is, I think it's probably one of the first times that we've, covered the span of Asian American history here. And so it's a great chance to learn about that for everyone.
Thank you. Very much looking forward to that next week. Anand, Kumar, a final word from you.
Yes, I'd like to say that, the thing that concerns everybody is the future, and the future, I mean by that, is the economy. Our community is determined, and there's a significant outpouring of generosity for various outreach events. So we're going to continue that, and we're going to all work together to make a difference. And I just want to add one more note. This is the first time we've been given an opportunity to come together and express ourselves on the media. So I thank you for that, Detroit Public Television.
Anand, thank you. Toshiki Masaki, word from you, sir.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this amazing panelist. And I'd like to echo Richard's comment that I think this documentary, 5-hour documentary, is an outstanding celebration of Asian community, Asian Americans. So I am very much looking forward to seeing the entire documentary. Thank you.
Well, we sure appreciate that. Thank you so much. Melissa Borja, a final note.
I'm really excited about this documentary for lots of reasons, in part because it really highlights the internal differences within the Asian American community. And I think this is something that we kind of ignore. Over and over again, we talk about what we have in common, but I think it's important for us to acknowledge our diverse histories, the ethnic diversity within Asian America, the religious diversity within Asian America, the fact that there's a lot of class diversity, a lot of political diversity. We have really different experiences. And I think it's really important for Asian Americans moving forward to respect that, to honor that, and also to treasure it, embrace it, and find the opportunities that exist within that diversity.
Melissa, thank you for that and for your great work. Jim Shimoura, a final note.
Well, I'm looking forward to the documentary. I think it would give a lot of people who are not familiar with the community an opportunity to really have some insight, and I am very excited about that possibility. Getting back to the general topic about anti-Asian sentiment and racism right now, I still am a moralist and believe that good will triumph over evil. But in order to do that, you have to have organization, focus, and a commitment, and something which is going to require the collective effort of a lot of different people. And one final comment, by the way, as well, the media does make a difference. During the early stages of the case back in 1983, one journalist stood up and really went to the bully pulpit, which really turned public opinion locally. That was the late Bill Bonds. And he used his ability to have this commentary on the airwaves as a very, very critical part of building, first of all, public understanding what the case represented, but also to try to build a moral high ground as to why we were fighting the way we did on behalf of Mrs. Chin. And for that reason, I think the media does have a role, and hopefully at some point down the road, there will be someone who can stand up and make that kind of public statement, which will drive the entire dialogue in a more positive direction.
Jim, thanks for being with us and for your reflections. Bill Kubota, a final word from you.
Bill Bonds. I didn't know he'd make this conversation. I don't know. I think this is just an amazing time. This is historical. And we might think about sheltering in place and all these other things, but this is a key moment in Asian American history. In the piece we did here that we showed, talked about trade and getting along, and it just seems like business and commerce and that sort of thing can solve a lot of things, including fixing our economy. But in the end, it kind of comes down to that, getting along with each other. This is a key part of that. And I think as we watch things develop, we've seen some Asian Chinese investment in even in our state in automotive production. But I think it's a world economy. We're a country of the world that now with so much immigration that we can think about it from the micro level of being spit on and that sort of thing. But it's a really, really big picture that I think a lot of people need to step back and look at on some of the stories we're doing. So I guess that would be my big picture comment on that, which really ties back to the Japanese car companies and the American car companies of the 80s and what was going on then.
Well, Bill, thanks. We'll make that the final word to our panelists, Toshiki Masaki, of course, to Bill Kubota and Melissa Borja. Great thanks to you. Jim Shimoura, Richard Mui, Anand Kumar, and Helen Zia, Ronald Hwang, and Francis, thank you for that. Additional thanks, of course, to Rebecca Islam, to the guy pushing the buttons, Zach Allen, thank you for that. And finally, to the audience, thank you for being with us. We're going to send out a survey to get your thoughts on what more we can do and how we can do it bigger and better next time. Don't forget, Asian Americans premieres next week on PBS. Until that time, I'm Fred Nahat. On behalf of all of us at Detroit Public TV, thank you for looking in. We'll see you next time.